What's going on, everyone? It's Justin here, and welcome to my ultimate smartphone comparison of what is the best Android phone so far in 2025. In front of me, I have 5 impressive flagship phones that have actually made this video really hard to make, including the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, the OnePlus 13, the Vivo X200 Pro, which is a phone that has gotten a lot of talk since last year, as well as the Honor Magic 7 Pro and the OPPO Find X8 Pro. These are all devices that are considered the flagship caliber and are at the best of what each brand is currently able to offer, which makes this video really hard but exciting to make as we take a look at categories such as design, hardware, display, cameras, batteries, performance, and more, and just the overall experience. And I'm not gonna be able to go through every single particular detail because we are talking about 5 devices at once, but I'm gonna try my best to break it down, make some objective comparisons, and ultimately help you decide which is the best smartphone of 2025 so far. I actually have an extra OPPO Find X8 Pro, so if you guys want to win that, just go ahead and drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below as to what your favorite smartphone feature is, as well as your Instagram username, and I'll be pinning the comment of the winner in the description section below and contacting the winner directly in 2 weeks. But without further ado, we have a lot to cover, so let's just go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the design and the hardware. When you take a look at these devices, 4 of them have followed a pretty similar design language of having all of the cameras, whether it is 3 or 4 of them, in a circular element and a little disc that protrudes out and allows the entire slab housing the 4 cameras to stay completely flush. Whereas on the other hand, Samsung has their cameras all individually separated with this little ring that goes around it. And even though it does look very elegant on camera, I do feel like the approach of having a singular pane is what I personally prefer. As for the material choices, the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra is the most durable device here. It is made out of a titanium band, and it also features the latest generation of Corning Gorilla Armor 2 glass. And even though it does feel very exposed, titanium is just a stronger material by default. But when it comes to the IP rating, the OnePlus, OPPO, Vivo, and Honor are IP68 and IP69 rated, whereas the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra is just IP68, which honestly, for most people is fine. I don't really mind the additional durability, but I just thought I'd mention it. And as you take a closer look at the ring design of these cameras, once again, each brand has taken a slightly different approach. Vivo and Honor, in a way, have kind of blended that camera element into a hidden manner, whereas OPPO and OnePlus has kind of highlighted that out, along with their partnership with Hasselblad. But of course, we have a lot to talk about when it comes to cameras later, but you can also see the display sizes on all of the devices are relatively similar. So when it comes to summing up the design of these devices, there's 2 ways to look at it. There's the practicality, the functionality, and the usability side, and there's just pure aesthetics and preference. So beginning with that first part, I feel like the Honor Magic 7 Pro does feel the most durable of the bunch. And with the IP69 rating, it really speaks for itself, but I feel like the material choice, the execution of it, definitely does add to the feel of comfort and durability. On the other hand, the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra does have the strongest glass of all these devices, but with just how well crafted and beautifully built it is, it does feel a bit fragile, but I personally think it is a beautiful smartphone. In terms of my personal favorite though, I would say it is the OnePlus 13. It has the perfect balance of a friendly look, feel, premium materials, chrome elegant elements as well, attention to detail, and I really do think it checks all of the boxes. And in terms of the device that has the most boring design, I think it has to be the Vivo X200 Pro. So when it comes to the displays, I've had individual experiences with all of these devices over the past few years, and honestly, they're all top notch. They look incredible. They have really good contrast as well as range and color representations. Some of them have their own characteristics of being more vibrant than others, whereas some are able to reach higher brightnesses. And also a very important feature is the eye care technologies that have been integrated in each one for using it in low brightnesses. The Samsung Galaxy lineup has been one of the leaders of displays for so many years now. And obviously Samsung, with their experience in smartphones supplying displays to other companies, is obviously one that continues to push the qualities of a smartphone display. This right here is a 6.9-inch 120Hz AMOLED display with a peak brightness of 2600 nits. And just like before, really nice saturation. It's able to reach a really nice consistent brightness, which is a difference between an HDR brightness and a constant brightness. And in broad daylight, I think it is able to perform very well. The OPPO Find X8 Pro has a 6.78-inch display with a 120Hz AMOLED display with a peak brightness of 4500 nits in HDR. I find that with OPPO devices, it is actually a very accurate representation when it comes to color. It doesn't push the saturation way too far compared to some of the other devices, and I also find that it still has a good amount of punch. I would prefer a little bit more sometimes, but I think it has definitely taken the balanced approach. The OnePlus 13, on the other hand, has a 6.82-inch OLED display, 120Hz, and it also has a peak brightness of 4500 nits in HDR. And I've always found that OnePlus has always done an excellent job. Even back in their budget days, I found that their displays were very well balanced in the terms of leaning towards giving a very vibrant and enjoyable multimedia consumption experience where the colors pop nicely, but at the same time not like popping out in your face where it might be a little bit inaccurate for editing some of your photos and also looking at them on your device. The Vivo X200 Pro has a 6.7-inch AMOLED display with a 120Hz refresh rate and a peak brightness of 4500 nits. But taking a look at this screen, I would say that the colors are nice and poppy. They're a little bit more saturated than what I see on the OPPO as well as the Honor, and even a tad bit more than the OnePlus actually, but below the Samsung. And last but not least, we have the Honor Magic 7 Pro, which on paper is the brightest display of the bunch at 5000 nits peak. I also like that they focus a lot about eye care technology as well, and so have other brands, but I feel like Honor adds an extra layer of customization to that depending on your own needs. The display characteristic I would say is actually pretty similar to OPPO, where it is a little bit more on the muted side. It doesn't have that push in saturation and vibrance and like that pop factor, but it's still a beautiful screen, and I think that's important for an accurate representation. But the drawback of the Honor here, again, is the fact that compared to the other devices that have a pinhole display camera, this one has a bit of a notch on the top that does take away from the real estate and the aesthetics a little bit. So after going through each one, when it comes to displays, all of these devices have excellent screens, and you're gonna see this commonality go into the performance category as well, where smartphones have had great displays and performance for so many years now. Objectively speaking, they are all AMOLED and OLED displays, which is essentially what you get across the board with smartphones that are not only in the flagship class, but also in the mid-tier, and in some cases, with budget smartphones as well. So I don't think that's a big factor here. So the next thing I want to talk about is DoorPal. It's a virtual doorbell system that eliminates any hardware doorbells, wiring, any installation. The application allows you to set a physical range within the geographical location of where you'd like to set it up, and it will notify you as your visitors come close to the location. A unique QR code or link can also be generated for visitors to scan to notify the host of their arrival. The application also allows for physical messaging as well as audio and video talk and recording. Some of the great features include customizability, such as being able to set certain hours that are available for visitors. So if you have like certain location hours of your storefront or office. An easy appointment management system to allow you to set up different meeting times, schedules, and calendars of when guests should be expected to arrive, as well as notifying friends and family so they can also receive notifications within the same household or workspace. So if you guys want to go and check out DoorPal for yourself, I'm going to drop a link down in the description section below and on screen, and a huge thanks to them for sponsoring this video. So now on to perhaps the most exciting but subjective category, and that is the camera. If I were to try to break down all of the different features and little quirks, as well as the functions of these cameras, this video would literally take hours and it still wouldn't be conclusive. So I'm gonna talk about the specs, but also give you guys some side-by-side comparisons, as well as my opinions to be able to make up your mind on what I would consider are the most common use everyday scenarios, such as the main camera, the ultra wide, the telephoto camera, as well as ultra zoom, as well as a low light sample, and also touch on video a little bit. But I would say it is a complicated debate because every company has their own processing as well as their own focus on certain areas, whether that is main, telephoto, portrait mode, or macro mode. But for the sake of doing a video where we talk about every single category, I'm just gonna break down the fundamentals. So breaking down the specs quickly, the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra has a quad camera setup. It is anchored by a 200 megapixel wide camera that has a 24mm field of view and an f1.7 aperture, along with a 10 megapixel f2.4 telephoto camera with a 67mm field of view, 50 megapixel f3.4 periscope telephoto camera that has a 111mm field of view, and a 50 megapixel f1.9 ultra-wide camera that gives you a 120-degree field of view. The OPPO Find X8 Pro, on the other hand, features a quad camera setup and highlights their partnership with Hasselblad, which we're actually covering on the channel right now, so that's very exciting. And that partnership is a co-development of better hardware and detail. The wide-angle camera is a 50 megapixel f1.6 with a 23mm field of view. It has a dual periscope setup with 50 megapixel cameras, one of which is a 73mm field of view, and the other is a 135mm field of view. And the ultra-wide camera is a 50 megapixel f2.0 with a 120-degree field of view. The Honor Magic 7 Pro also has an interesting camera setup. As you'll see throughout these spec reads, some of these cameras have a 200 megapixel camera on the wide, others have it on the main camera. So in this case, you have a 50 megapixel main camera with an f1.4 aperture and a 24mm field of view, and that is the widest aperture of the bunch here. A 200 megapixel f2.6 periscope telephoto camera with a 72mm field of view, a 50 megapixel f2.0 aperture ultra-wide camera with a 12mm field of view. So I feel like this is like a pretty traditional balanced setup where your ultra zoom camera is actually the one that has 200 megapixels to be able to use that hybrid element to really allow you to zoom in from a distance, but by default, the lens itself is actually a pretty normal focal length. When it comes to the camera specs of the Vivo X200 Pro, I would say that this is the phone that I've gotten the most questions about when it comes to camera quality in quite a while. It was kind of like the consensus #1 that I was really excited to get in the office, and they have a co-partnership with Zeiss that they work to engineer the clarity, obviously the lens experience, and professional color accuracy. And the main camera features a 50 megapixel f1.6 sensor with a Zeiss wide-angle lens that is 23mm, a 200 megapixel f2.7 periscope camera that is an 85mm focal length, a 50 megapixel f2.0 aperture ultra-wide camera that gives you 119 degrees, and there's also a dedicated imaging chip. And I feel like what's talked about a lot is the fact that it has the largest overall sensor on its main camera. The OnePlus 13 is a 50 megapixel triple camera setup across the board that has been co-developed with Hasselblad, just like with the OPPO line. The main camera is an f1.6 aperture with a 23mm focal length. The periscope camera is an f2.6 aperture and a 73mm focal length. And the ultra-wide is an f2.0 with a 120-degree focal length. So now that we've highlighted the camera setups of each one, let's go ahead and show you guys some side-by-side samples. So looking at all of the samples, these cameras produce relatively sharp and vibrant images, but I will say the Samsung tends to produce a more natural and softer looking image, in my opinion, that are more true to life compared to some of the other devices that may have had a bit more sharpening and processing that is evident from the image. The Honor and the OPPO in particular, I noticed had a little bit of a heavier processing. The OnePlus 13 sits somewhere in the middle as well, producing images that are quite balanced and safe, but generally leaning towards a warmer side, while the OPPO is the opposite with cooler images. I think it's clear to say that from these images though, the Vivo was my favorite that stood out above the rest in terms of depth, dynamic range, color accuracy, and just due to the larger sensor and the great optics. I took this phone to Africa, and as you can see from the landscape images, I would say that this is probably the closest I've come to wanting to actually take photos on my smartphone as opposed to my digital point and shoot camera. And even though from my comparison, it is clear that each phone has its own category that they're really good at, for day-to-day images in most scenarios that I would use a smartphone, even though all the phones performed very well, I just found that I gravitated towards the Vivo. I think the rest of the phones are more similarly apart from the Samsung, which seems to render color a bit differently than the other phones. What I did also notice is that the macro and portrait modes on the Honor seem to struggle quite a bit with proper edge detection and focusing. As for the video recording capabilities, some of the phones can record at an 8K resolution and others can record at 4K, but I think the two leaders here were the Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra and the Vivo X200 Pro, both of which also offer log video recording. So now let's go ahead and talk about performance, touch a bit on software, and the battery life of these devices. And as I mentioned before, as a bit of a disclaimer, performance has been excellent across all of these devices for so many years now, to the point where it's really waiting to see which category or which company is going to push the boundary, but there hasn't really been a need for it because, I mean, these smartphones are more powerful than what you're usually going to be doing on a mobile device. On one side, these three smartphones here feature the latest and greatest Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, which is a 3nm architecture. They come in ranges of 12 to even 16 gigabytes of overall RAM. And on this side here, the Vivo X200 Pro and the OPPO Find X8 Pro utilize the MediaTek Dimensity 9400 series processor. And I know, similar to like back in the day when people talk about like Exynos, MediaTek, and Snapdragon, I would say that in North America, people are typically more used to a Snapdragon processor, and I do know there are people who are particularly going to lean towards a smartphone that has the Snapdragon processor. When it comes to the raw benchmark performance, it is about 10% apart. The Snapdragon benchmarks at just around 9,000s when it comes to the Geekbench score, whereas the MediaTeks come in at the high 8,000s. All of these devices are ones that are going to deliver in terms of performance when it comes to gaming, as well as photo and video editing on there. And I would also say I didn't experience any major overheating on any of these devices. What sets them apart and what I feel like you should consider a little bit more is the software. From watching this video and seeing the interfaces, right off the bat, the phone that has the most similar experience to stock Android is the OnePlus 13. I've always liked how clean it is, and I always found that OnePlus's Oxygen OS actually complemented stock Android and added additional and useful productivity features and accessibility features that I actually really appreciate, as opposed to a fully skinned version of stock Android. Samsung, on the other hand, has definitely come a long way. They still have a lot of features, AI features, productivity features, and I would say if you're leaning into productivity, having the S Pen is a differentiating factor that none of these devices have. It really is built to be a workhorse and a powerhouse. The flat display, the larger screen, and I feel like hardcore Samsung users really know how to utilize every inch of what Samsung has to offer when it comes to additional features. Vivo, OPPO, and Honor, on the other hand, definitely come shipped with a lot of software in it and a lot of different AI stuff, some of which work better than others and some of which are ones that you will never use. But at the end of the day, you can remove it, you can customize it, but I personally like an out-of-the-box experience that is nice and clean. They did come a long way. I feel like phones, even a few years ago, came with a lot more random software that has been built in, but I do like a very simple experience, and I just find that it's one thing to have a lot of pre-installed applications, and it's another to have ones that are actually useful, well optimized, and just work. And that's the difference between Samsung and some of these other overseas smartphones where I feel like they just have too much added. So now on to the battery life. All of these devices have a 3nm architecture when it comes to the processor technology. And in addition to that, AMOLED displays and OLED displays are relatively efficient across the board. It really does come down to the brightness that you're using it at, so I'm gonna lay it out a bit more objectively and also share a bit about my experience. So starting with the Samsung Galaxy, this device features the smallest battery on paper of the bunch at 5,000 milliamp hours. It has 45 watts of peak wired charging and 15 watts wireless, whereas the OnePlus 13 and the Vivo X200 Pro have the largest battery at 6,000 milliamp hours. And I think what's impressive about the OnePlus 13 is that it has 80 watts of Super VOOC charging and 50 watts of Air VOOC charging, And similarly, but a little bit different, the Vivo X200 Pro has 90 watts of flash charge and 30 watts of wireless charging. The OPPO Find X8 Pro has a 5910 mAh battery with an 80 watt wired charging and 50 watt wireless, whereas the Honor Magic 7 Pro has a 5850 mAh battery with the fastest 100 watt wired charging and 80 watts of wireless charging. So when you take a look at all these devices, you have some here that are all pretty close to 6,000 milliamp hours. And I would say the best battery life that I experienced was on the OnePlus 13. A very balanced device, as we mentioned. When it comes to the specs, as well as the display, as well as the software, it is really built to be optimized like this, and it all makes sense. It has the largest hardware battery as well, and a really good balance of fast charging. And I mean, the speed and everything when it comes to wired and wireless is really impressive. On the other hand, I've seen Honor push the boundaries of wired and wireless charging. They've actually been working on charging that goes to like 200 watts, but obviously when it comes to the consumer standpoint, we have 100 watts that is readily available right now. General battery life of the device between the Vivo, OPPO, and the Honor was pretty similar. It was really the OnePlus that set itself apart, but 100 watts of wired charging and 80 watts of wireless charging is truly impressive. The Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, on the other hand, still had a full day of battery life. And I do feel like for the size of the device, the battery is something that could be larger. It isn't like Apple, who have created their own chip architecture where the battery is always going to be a little bit smaller on paper. You're comparing a smartphone that has the same processor, but about a 20% smaller battery than all of the other counterparts, while being the largest smartphone here. And on top of that, having the slowest wired and wireless charging performance. And so I feel like that is kind of the one category where Samsung is just behind, and it's not that hard to fix. So at the end of the day, what is the best smartphone in my opinion? And I think the beauty of this industry, with so many devices coming out, with some being available in North America and still having access to them through importing them, it's just such a hard decision to make, because I think from what you have noticed, each phone has their own category that they excel in, but it really comes down to which phone checks off the most boxes that are of importance to you. So when it comes to the camera, my favorite device is the X200 Pro from Vivo. I believe that that was a phone that really lived up to its hype when it comes to pushing the boundaries of smartphone camera technology. The Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra is obviously another device that is always pretty much among the top 3 when it comes to cameras of Android smartphones, and I have an excellent experience with that as well, and of the bunch, it has the best video performance. When it comes to the hardware, I think this is where all companies have actually done a really good job. I think every company here has taken a pretty conservative approach and didn't really do anything that was out of the norm for them. With OPPO, Vivo, and Honor, they all went with a very simple design, circular cameras, flush edges, and I think that looks great. And same goes for OnePlus. But OnePlus did change it up a little bit by having the chrome edges and the leather back. And I think some people really like that, whereas others don't prefer it. But I do feel like when it comes to like an interesting design approach, I really like the OnePlus, and I also really like the Honor's silver finish in particular. I think that's very unique. But even though Samsung's design could be called a little bit boring, I actually think I like the blocky design the most on the S25 Ultra. Performance is something that is not going to be an issue on any of these devices, whether it's the MediaTek Dimensity or the Snapdragon Elite line. Performance is about 10% apart, and all these devices come in up to 12 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes of RAM, so if you need that little extra, then that is determined for you. But when it came to the battery life, as I mentioned, the OnePlus 13 was the most impressive, and a lot of these phones have 6,000 milliamp hour batteries, and so that is where there was an edge. And of course, charging technology is also another thing that we touched on. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you let me know down in the comment section below of which phone you think won. And as always, it is tough to really pick one out of the bunch of these devices here. They're all just so good nowadays. So as always, I'll see you guys in the next one, and thanks for watching.